Hello, and welcome to another Uptime FM episode. I'm your host, Sean C. Davis, and today I'm going to be joined by Mark Noonan. Mark is a senior developer over at Cypress, and we're gonna spend the whole episode talking about testing, which is that everyone's favorite subject to avoid? I don't know. We're gonna find out. Most of my early coding days were spent with Ruby on Rails, and anyone who knows Rails knows that testing is big. It's huge. In fact, there was even this trend, and maybe it's still a thing. I'm not sure, but the trend was that we would write tests before we had the code that would make the test pass. And that's a whole topic that we may or may not get into. I don't know, but the last decade or so has seen this major shift toward JavaScript code and toward putting more power and therefore more responsibility in the hands of front end developers. But testing, for whatever reason, hasn't seemed to be as high of a priority with many modern JavaScript projects. And I should at least speak for myself here and say that I write far fewer tests than I used to. And so why is that? And how should we be testing web projects today? These are two very loaded questions, but two questions that I'm hoping we can at least partially answer today with Mark. And so with that, let's bring him in. Welcome to the show, Mark.
Hey, thanks very much.
Excited to have you on here. Excited to get into testing. But before we do that, we have to start with what might be the most important question of the day. And that is, what is the best sandwich?
Okay, so I might have said a year ago a Cuban sandwich, but about 9 months ago, I was diagnosed with celiac disease, which means all sandwiches are now made with like fake bread and have this
Yes.
like crumbly weirdness to them. So my favorite sandwich now is like a taco with a corn tortilla. That's as close as we're getting. And I really like all of the food that was gluten-free before. So that's the restriction of being celiac, is you have to eat gluten-free food. But something like a corn tortilla that was already good without any gluten is so much more appealing to me than like the fake store bread that is just falls apart. So I haven't had a sandwich that was any good in a long time.
Now I've tried to make I should say I've made gluten-free bread before with just like some sort of nut flour here and there, but
Yeah.
it's really hard to get that texture just right. So yeah, I hear you. Well, okay, so what do you prefer to stuff the tortilla with?
So sort of regular taco beef and tomatoes and cheese and stuff like that. Um and like fajitas, those types of things, just chicken or whatever, and lots of veggies and beans and stuff is always nice.
This is great. Okay, so I feel like that's a great way to turn around the diagnosis there, because yeah, tacos are amazing and very versatile.
Yeah, you can lean right into them.
That's right. That's right. Okay, so yeah, let's dive into testing a bit. And you just heard my opening monologue there, that I hear a lot less about testing and personally spend a lot less time testing than I had before. And I know it's a huge loaded topic, and certainly many factors are involved. But let's just start there, kind of broad strokes. So from an overall perspective, why does it seem like this reliance on testing has decreased in recent years, or is that not the case?
Yeah, I think for me, I have seen a little bit more talk about testing in front end, especially for the last few years. And as developers, maybe kind of 5, 6 years ago, the standard tools for testing were focused on maybe QA engineers who were writing like that developers might use to test their websites, tools like Selenium that would be part of a QA process that weren't necessarily used by developers because maybe you needed to write those tests in Java. Maybe you needed to run separate stuff to get them to work. And then visiting the website and like interacting with it was this complicated over the network communication that you also had to like learn about and deal with. So that might have been a reason that front end testing was a little bit overlooked, because if you're a developer, that's a distraction from like getting your tickets done, and it's a lot of extra work outside of your normal context. And then if you're writing front end 5, 10 years ago as well, you might not have been doing as much complicated behavior. So like my career began at an agency where we did very little testing. We only had one client who wanted to pay us to write automated tests for their websites, but they were mostly display-based websites. And the management model of like a marketing website as opposed to a store or a complicated app, the content is sort of seen in an editorial way. So the review process and deployment process for new content is more like you would have in a magazine or a publishing company, where the marketing team owns the content, they'll review it. Automated tests would tell you things that would also be caught by this manual publishing review process. So I think now testing tools are a little better, and websites have gotten much more complex with more functionality that requires heavy front end testing and like too much to do manual review. So there's more interest, I think, in the last 3 or 4 years in testing again.
Yeah, and you kind of touched on a whole topic there, which I feel like we could dive into because I spent many years in agency as well, and that is, do you work the testing into the price of the project? Do you just? It sounded like you didn't there, but let's put that aside for a second and just transitioning. So keeping it broad, though, should it sounds like tools have gotten better, but that QA folks have traditionally done more of the testing, especially for front end developers. So, should, in your opinion, should front end developers be writing tests today, or maybe, yeah, to what extent should front end engineers be involved in testing?
So I'm all for front end engineers getting heavily involved in the testing process. It doesn't mean that you don't, if you're at a company that has a separate QA team, that you're like, oh, I can drop the QA team now. Developers are going to write end-to-end tests, maybe component tests. They'll write unit tests for their functions. I don't think that you can separate out the responsibilities to where it's just like, okay, one person's going to do all of this. But it is really comforting as a developer to run tests and make sure that I didn't break any existing functionality, especially tests that are written in a way where you can change the application code without changing the test code very much. So that has a lot to do with how you design your tests. But I really get uneasy when I see heavy code changes and heavy test changes that appear to be like unrelated, because now we're running new tests against new code and we don't see the same level of confidence maybe. So like getting familiar with testing and good testing practices helps you like have a more confidence as you push stuff that things are really still working and that the parts that you touched are working in the way that you intend. And so I see tests as like documenting, here's exactly how I expect this component or this page to function. Even though you may not have the wide imagination of a QA person to be like, okay, but what if my name is like, null or something, and Mr. Null has a problem logging in or whatever. Like the creativity of the QA person to test all these inventive scenarios is different than developers testing some known defined things are working.
That makes sense. Now, can you give a specific example of a scenario where you might make heavy code changes, but your tests wouldn't have to change? I'm just trying to like picture when that has happened to me.
So if we have a kind of big UI change that's not a real functional change, so we're just kind of pushing a redesign of a page. Let's just take a header as an example. So the login button's in the same place. The things a user is able to do are all the same, but actually no, the login button might not be in the same place, right? We're moving it around, or we've changed the responsive behavior or something like that. If our tests are written to select the elements they're interacting with, and to back up for a second, this is like an automated UI test that's going to choose parts of the page to click on or assert about and behave as a user. And if we're checking that, like, okay, there's a div, and inside that div, there's a direct child that's a UL, and inside that, there's a button, and inside that, and our tests are caring about the DOM structure, we have a really kind of brittle test when we change the UI versus a test that says, find the button that's labeled login and click that button. And then we have a test where the test code can be exactly the same through a substantial UI refactor, because we're using stuff like accessibility, which shouldn't change for a UI change, right? There should be no change in a keyboard behavior, for example, or in the screen reader behavior if there's a purely visual change. unless elements are being reordered. But like the way you reach those elements is going to be stable, and then your test can rerun and you can say, great, I changed 100 lines of HTML. The output of my component is totally different now, and I can run the same test as before. As opposed to when I'm reviewing a PR, the design changed and a million tests also changed. Like, it's still valid to test things and change tests when they need to be changed, but it's so nice to change tests only the minimum necessary to catch up to actual changed functionality. So that's kind of what I mean by that.
Yeah, okay, because sometimes you're going to have that totally makes sense from a UI perspective. I'm going to move things around, but they're going to behave the same way. Now, if you're actually putting in a new feature that's going to change some sort of functionality, you had mentioned, well, you don't ideally you still don't see big changes in the code and the test that's testing the code at the same time. Is there any advice you have for folks to to think about testing when they're going after new features, functional features?
Yeah, you talked a little bit about like sort of test-driven development where you might write the test first. And I sort of practice that myself a little bit, but I'll often write the code to get something working. It might not be the code that I like or I want to keep, but like I figured out the solution. And then when it's time to write a test, I will try to describe the pieces of that solution in the test. And so I'm understanding the new surface area. All of the old tests should still be passing, and the new surface area of what functionality I'm adding is going to be like a net new test, unless we've disrupted something in the code itself. So when we're thinking about almost test-driven development, where like we have the functionality figured out and we can specify, okay, well, this is the new button in our test. This is what it's supposed to be doing. This is the side effect I expect after that. Considering that from a point of view of like, now I'm really doing the implementation. Even if my sketch code was good enough, like now I'm really building it up from the test point of view, and that it should be a little bit of a red flag if you have to change a test that seems unrelated. That's like you can change it to get it green, right? But what's the reason that your code change altered another test that doesn't seem like it's supposed to be related? Maybe you added global CSS that hit a button, so you had to put like a force click into your test file to make your UI work correctly. Well, that's broken for the user as a side effect of your code changes. So like the failures that come that are not expected for you, that's the whole value of having test suites run while you develop, is to be able to investigate that and not just make the test pass, but like figure out why did your code changes introduce these unexpected test failures elsewhere.
Yeah. Okay. That makes a lot of sense. And then I know you can still run into a scenario where maybe that test actually wasn't written very well in the first place, but a lot of times you're writing those tests in context the first time around. And if you break them later on, you want to at least spend some time to figure out why exactly you broke it. Right.
Yeah. And there's one thing I'd add to this, which is an often like a side effect I see of writing tests where I didn't realize for a long time, I didn't think of it this way. Everything in the test is like part of the spec, right? It's part of how we're saying this is supposed to behave. So if we have things in our test that we don't actually care about, and I'll go back to those like DOM element locators. If we're having a test that says, oh, it should be this really long XPath to finally choose this thing, that's not just here's how to get the element, but that's us saying it matters if the DOM structure changes for some reason. We're saying it matters that this 20-line XPath, this is part of the spec of our application, when that's often not really true. So another part of like good test design and practical test design is to make sure that everything that your test has to go through to pass is something that you actually care about, not just coincidentally how the DOM was that day, and then you have to debug these failures and rewrite your tests because they're targeting things based on things you don't care about and users don't care about.
Yeah, exactly. I feel like that's a good piece of practical advice there. Is that everything you're testing, you should actually care about. So, yeah, and speaking of taking a practical approach, there's there are so many different types of tests that we can write and so many different corners of any sort of application that we can test as well. And so if someone's coming in totally brand new to this space, how, where do they start? What's, if you're going to give somebody advice on what should they be testing, how much should they be testing, etc., what are you going to tell to the beginner?
So I would start with end-to-end tests, and I think they're the easiest to relate to user behavior. So an end-to-end test would start with a command that visits a web page, and then on that web page, you can click things, you can assert the content, you can say it should have a H1 with this text, should have this mobile menu. And so you're doing exactly what a user does, go to a page, interact with it. In many cases, there are tools you can use to kind of record an example test based on you clicking around. So you can get to know how the framework you're using works by seeing some of the code it generates based on your interactions in the page. And so I remember like being asked this by somebody who came to a new company, and she was working with a code base that didn't have a lot of tests. And my suggestion to her was to add end-to-end first, and then kind of work her way into the other testing types. And one reason it's easier to understand, the other is probably more critical to your business. So the like core things to test before every deployment, and I've heard this from a few people, is like, can people log in and can they give us money? So an end-to-end test of your checkout flow where you go, and you might even buy a real product for $1 using a discount code or something, right? You might actually really have a test that goes through and confirms your checkout flow works and that your login works. If those don't work, not only can you not make money, users probably can't easily report problems because they're blocked from logging in. So like you would detect that later in some other metrics. So probably don't deploy code that doesn't pass like those 2 core happy path tests. And then I think if you're writing something that's brand new, component tests are a little bit more interesting because you might not have the full application yet as you're starting in a greenfield project. The API might not be ready if another team is working on the API. So you can build up little parts of your application based on designs and stuff like that, and make tests that say, okay, my button's specified to work this way. Now I'm going to make a login form, and I know everything about how that works. So I can test it in a component test, which brings up the form just by itself and doesn't have the whole application running, doesn't need to have your server or your backend. And you can say, these are the valid states, these are the invalid states. This is what I'm supposed to send when the user logs in. And then you can assert about your payload of your login form and have it essentially done and ready to drop in before the homepage is built, before the API is deployed. As long as the API matches what the team told you was coming, your login form, the schema of the API is the same. You're like really ahead of what the application can do. So that's what we use at Cypress. Building the last version of Cypress, like the major UI change, was the UI development got out quite far ahead of the API development because different teams were working at different paces, and the ability to like build it up with component tests was really important to us. But I still think end-to-end is an easier starting point if you're new to development, especially, and you're trying to figure out where does testing fit in. End-to-end is real good starting point.
I like that. And so quick clarification on the component test. So they're not actually running a browser. Are they just running against the component code?
So there's 2 kinds, and in Cypress they're running in a real browser. But the kind of industry standard at the moment is like Jest test, or test run with testing library of UTest utils that are usually running in Node in like JS DOM simulated browser environments. So that's my team at Cypress, is the component testing team. We might talk more about it at the end, but it is the same structure as an end-to-end test, except instead of visiting your whole app and clicking to get to a certain state, it runs a dev server and it mounts a component in a real web page that you define as like your holder web page.
Okay.
So you can do all the same testing there.
Very cool. Okay, and you mentioned Cypress, which was where you work today, and Jess, and I think said a couple other tools in there. So yeah, let's take a minute to talk about what are your preferred tools that you use to write all these tests.
So I'm like obviously very heavily biased towards Cypress. But my experience with it started like back in 2017. So I think Cypress had maybe just reached a V1 at that point. And Gleb Bahmutov, if anybody's into testing, they probably are familiar with Gleb. He came to Atlanta to do a presentation that was not really about Cypress. It was about just snapshot diffs and
Mhm.
this incredible layered set of things he built on top of that, plugins and stuff like that. So he just blew my mind right out my ears at that presentation. I was fascinated. I was just learning JavaScript. Like I was just starting to get ready to look for that first job. And that was my exposure to testing. So I learned all the other tools kind of through following Gleb and learning more about Cypress, and learned about Jest like after I knew about end-to-end tests. And so for me, everything that was not running in a browser was like more hassle. So I did write Jest tests at a previous job. Um, and those were, unit tests that were just testing individual functions, as well as component tests that were doing that virtual sort of simulated browser we talked about. So that's really been my world, has been kind of the Cypress world. I know a little bit about Selenium. I never used it, but I worked at a company that had a team that used Selenium. So we would work and collaborate with them as developers by putting in test IDs. We had to keep encouraging them to talk to us. I think a lot of developers and QAs are isolated from each other. We're like, no, we like testing on our team. We want to help you. So tell us what you need and we'll make it easy. And that's a big topic for me. But so Selenium was one way to do it. Playwright is out now as well, which is an end-to-end sort of testing setup that's architected a little differently from Cypress. So there's different pros and cons there. And those are sort of the main things right now, like in front-end testing. Cypress, Playwright, and Selenium. Still very popular, Selenium.
Okay, and so that's our state of just kind of state of affairs today. Now, where do you think things are going to go in the next year, 2 years, 5 years? I don't know. Are we stabilizing? Or are things rapidly changing in the testing world? What's going to happen?
I think things are getting a little bit more sophisticated in helping you get your job done as a developer. So like all the tools are iterating. I'm not very familiar with what's going on in the worlds of the other two tools, like kind of day by day, what are the new innovations in Playwright or in Selenium. But there is definitely a trend towards like supporting developers writing tests. Like we kind of have the idea of, yes, everybody should be testing more. What are the kind of ancillary tools, supplemental tools we can create to make tests easier to write or make different testing types easier? So the I think component tests coming into the browser is like coming in the future as well. I believe Playwright has experimental support for some component testing in the browser. We're at like that stage in Cypress, and I think people are tired of not having that interactivity. There's a package called Jest Preview that also adds like, not exactly, it doesn't run the test in the browser, but it can show you later, hey, here's what really mounted. So getting out of the dark times of seeing terminal output from a front end like UI test of just seeing the HTML in the terminal, I think that's a big thing that's changing. At Cypress, we're doing more like, integrations with information you're already generating through your test recording activity. So surfacing some of that. For example, if you have flaky tests in CI, maybe popping that up in the UI for you so you can see, well, here's a test that failed twice and then passed in CI, so it was green, but you still
Mhm.
want to know something's up when this test is failing 60% of the time and still passing eventually. Is your application non-deterministic? Is there something in your environment that's not getting set up in time for the test to run correctly? So some like extra rich feedback around that as the tools all get more mature. Like that's the stuff that I'm particularly interested in. The core ideas are, I feel like, well established in my little bubble, but I agree. A lot of developers aren't testing or aren't thinking about testing. The one other thing that I think is coming is more and more focus on accessibility as the like core of
Hmm.
front end quality, and then as a way to make your testing easier. Maybe that's a wish for me because I like accessibility a lot, and I see it as like the internal and external facing quality like come together in making something accessible.
Hmm.
So
Hmm.
I find yeah, that's seems to be a trend as well of more testing tools adopting accessibility features.
I love that, and I would love to see all of those things because I think accessibility, like having tests for accessibility, would be would help improve all the front ends that I build. But even when you said that folks are working on picking out these flaky tests and helping you fix them, it's like yes, that for me
Yeah,
was that was the most frustrating part of writing tests, and I think by far the most difficult piece of an application to debug, because you're like, is the test wrong? Is the code wrong? Is it right? And it's just sometimes it's wrong. Yeah, I don't know. Figuring out how to solve those problems faster, I feel like will cut down on the amount of time debugging.
yeah, absolutely. And I used to think that Flake was bad, and now just see it more as another signal of potentially a user-facing issue. Often it's a test setup issue,
Mm-hmm.
right? Your
Mm-hmm.
database hasn't finished resetting before your end-to-end starts or something like that. So
Right.
you have like race conditions hidden in your test world. But really often it is race conditions in your application that show up when there's not that many resources. So you're running in CI on a machine that's maxed out at 4 GB or whatever,
Okay.
and then your application behaves differently in a way that we don't see on our nice Macs. And so the feedback on the flaky test is potentially this is a user-facing issue. So we want to not just power through it and ignore it. Maybe we want to drill down and see what's going on there. Um, it also can be a sign that we don't control everything in our tests, which is like in a true end-to-end test, you might want to tolerate that. You might want to say like, okay, we're not mocking anything. We're not stubbing any network responses or anything like that. We're just going all the way
Mhm.
through, and there might be some flake because that touches a third-party thing that could be down, could be restarting or whatever. But as you think about the other testing types, once you get inside the end-to-end level and move into component tests can be anything from the size of a button to like your massive interactive tables and long credit card application forms or whatever, right? Where in that world, you can totally control the behavior. Those components might not even be the ones that talk to the network. They might just emit events and like receive props. So you can test like a
Mhm.
million scenarios in your component tests that are unlikely to be flaky. And if they're flaky, it's really probably a sign that you have like a random number generator in your component or something. Like there's no network unless
Yeah.
you want a network in a component test. And most of the time I don't. I would stub any network requests. So that is a way of like using the information about what's flaky to go, okay, well, is the component test for what's on this page ever flaky? Where at what level of the onion does the flake begin? Um, that's very likely something that involves a network and takes an unpredictable amount of time, um, or renders a massive list. And on smaller machines, we just can't get the list rendered in time to click something, so we click the wrong
Mhm.
thing or something like
Mhm.
that. So yeah, that feedback from what's happening on the other machines, understanding that as you develop locally and you might have a passing test locally, but a failure in CI, getting that feedback as you work, I think is like super useful.
Yeah, definitely. So really exciting to see where all of this is going. And now I wanted to come back to a topic we were talking about earlier, right before we transition into the next segment, which is so you mentioned in your agency days that some clients didn't want to pay for tests, and I'm curious now that you've had more experience in the whole testing world and all of that. Do you have a recommendation for folks who are building projects, maybe not for some product where it's yes, it's expected that you write tests, but yeah, particularly in that client focused, the agency world, should everyone be working tests into their application regardless? Does it make sense that you should still let the client control this? What's your take on it now, looking back on that?
Yeah, so even at that agency, I did write some tests kind of voluntarily.
Mhm.
And I think the way to approach it is maybe different from putting them in CI. A lot of the agency work was driven on a big CMS platform, so you would have like deployments of code, certainly, but you didn't necessarily build the real website. Like it kind of lived in the staging environment and into production environment. So you could
Okay.
write Cypress tests that would visit staging or dev or whatever, or whatever they needed to do, and go and do an important workflow. And I do remember writing one for a credit card application form. That's why it came to mind, because manually testing that thing was frustrating. Whereas I could point a test at the page before we even drop the cache in production and make sure in production I'm getting all the right behavior, and then we can drop the cache and make it live. So those like a la carte testing things where it didn't even live in the same repo, it was my own repo that had the test in there.
Okay.
Um, like you can add testing without having to get into a pipeline. You can add testing that runs on a schedule in your own, like even your GitHub actions, and visits a certain place every night to make sure that like content authors didn't add JavaScript somehow that broke a page. Like there are health checks you can do on schedules. That's another way to use testing that's not a gate for deployments. So I think if your client is satisfied with manual testing and full control over deployments, that is kind of their prerogative. But if you want the extra confidence, and I certainly did for something complicated like that, I think it's perfectly reasonable to add your own tests, more like a separate testing team would do. So it's not uncommon to have tests in a separate repo from code and have tests that point at different like full environments as opposed to running against something on localhost that you've been able to deploy as part of your CI build process. So yeah, I think it's a really good starting point at an agency that like you should decide how much time you want to spend manual testing yourself before you hand work over, and how much risk you want to allow your clients to take. It does not take very long to write these kinds of end-to-end tests. And internally, when you're writing functions and components, that's kind of your world anyway. That's not really the client's business, how you get your own confidence in
Mhm.
the work you hand to them.
Sure.
So like if what it takes for you to be confident is component tests that you can open while you develop, which is now my favorite thing in the world. I want to have one component, one test. If I break something that component A is responsible for, I need the component A.spec to tell me that I broke something immediately. And I even turn the timing
Mm.
down. Like we talked about, there's no network layer, or very rarely a network. So I turn the timing down for failures really low in my component tests. I say, like, don't wait for the page to suddenly display. Like, don't wait 4 seconds for a button to appear that wasn't there before. Fail in 10 milliseconds. I want to know immediately,
Mhm. Mhm.
because then now that gives me confidence as I develop and as I work quickly that I have accurately like documented everything the component's responsible for. And if I delete an element or I delete a whole component, I know what I'm deleting, I know what I'm losing because I have this cycle. So that helps me now deliver work that I'm more confident in. And I would probably do that anyway, even if a client didn't particularly want it, because it's just like in my brain as the development cycle. And
Yep. Yeah.
it's, yeah, like coming back to a component 6 months later, seeing a test file that explains what it does, just great.
Amazing. Yes, and I totally agree, and had a very similar experience in the agency world as well. And eventually, you just kind of say this is part of the development cycle, and it works its way into your estimates and all of that. Well, that's great. Let's transition now into our last segment for the day, where I'm going to ask you a series of 9 quick questions with probably relatively short answers. We'll see how it goes. All right.
Okay.
Number 1. What is your favorite open source product?
It is Cypress. Cypress is an open
All
source
right.
product. I have
Yes.
joy of being a full-time open source developer. I don't know how I got this lucky, but yeah, and I would say Vue test utils is my second favorite. If I have to pick one, that was just really good before I could do component testing in the browser.
Yeah, I wasn't sure if you would say Cypress. I write these down ahead of times, and I'm like, I don't, sometimes it's like, yeah, I mean, it's my product, and I'm proud of it. But I love this other tool and all of that.
Yeah,
So,
yeah. I probably have lots of little favorites. I haven't thought about it in advance. So yeah.
Fair. Okay, number 2. What work in your career are you most proud of to date?
This is a tricky one. I probably still, before I became a full-time developer, I worked at a nonprofit with adults with developmental disabilities. And I was there for about 7 years, and I made some really rough PHP and HTML and JS stuff that replaced a manual email process that we had. So like my old boss was able to stop writing out 30 people's schedules on paper and typing out the emails by hand, saving like a couple hours every Friday or something. And so she was great. And she was also like supportive to me learning to be a developer, which led me to me leaving the company. But I'm really happy because that old stuff still works. It's like 7 years later, and those emails are going out every week. And every now and then I get, because I'm CC'd on that on my personal account. So I just see them coming out in like beautiful alphabetical order. And I'm like, yeah, she's using it. She's using the thing. So yeah, that type of work is like really meaningful to me. So I'm really happy that work can be useful.
That's great. Okay, number 3, tabs or spaces?
I'm a tabs person.
You're a tabs person. All
and,
right.
And more to the point, I think it's actually resolved. The reason the tabs are better is if you have accessibility in mind and you need to increase your font size on the editor, you can reduce the size of a tab in your editor too. So your indentation's not super wide because you've needed to use a bigger font size. So like these are independent settings you can control in the editor. Whereas if every tab is just full of spaces, your font size is much more annoying because it also increases your indentation. Fundamentally, I don't care, but that pushes me. I never cared until someone pointed that out.
Interesting, because yeah, I've been a spaces person. I've never heard that argument. So it's a good one. I like it. All right, number 4. This one actually came from a conversation with my wife the other day, and I really liked it. So I was like, I'm going to use this in the show. Let's see how it goes. So Number 4 is, if you had to move to another city tomorrow, and can't stay in the current city you're in, where would you go?
I would probably go back home to Ireland, where I'm from. And I guess if I had to, I would go to Clonmel, which is my hometown, which is a small town inside Tipperary in Ireland. It's nice. It's quiet. I like it there.
Amazing. Okay. You knew exactly what that was. That was great.
Yeah. Something came to my head immediately. Yeah.
All right. Number 5. So this time of year, there's a lot of these year in review posts, like recapping outcomes from predictions from last year and various web development topics and so forth. And so we talked a little bit about testing, but if I were to say we fast forward a year, at this time next year, what's one thing that's going to be in most of these articles?
I feel like a lot more people are going to use Svelte. I was at a conference the other day and there was a Svelte kit. No, it was a Svelte presentation. And the guy happened to realize that Svelte kit had just kind of reached 1.0. And the room was also like pretty full. So that in terms of front-end frameworks, I think that's going to be growing this year. Yeah, and if we're just picking one thing, I'll say Svelte, more Svelte.
I like that. I read somewhere that someone predicted in one of these posts, they said that this is going to be the make or break year for Svelte and Svelte Kit. And I was like, I mean, I don't know if it's going anywhere if it doesn't get as popular, but I think that's a great hot take. Yeah.
And I don't think it has to go anywhere really. It's just like a cool thing some people can use.
Yeah, and that's fine.
Yeah. It's just like, okay, great. Yeah, and I haven't actually used it very much, but I really like this guy's talk, so I'm super interested now.
Okay, great. Yeah, and I've only done a real quick kind of proof of concept, but I'm hoping to build a new site with it this year as well. So yeah, this is great. All right, number 6. What is either the best or the most useful advice that you've received throughout your career?
Um, all right, I have another one, and I cannot remember exactly where it came from, but it's don't practice your mistakes. um,
I
which
like
is
that.
it's from a music teacher, who maybe I saw in a video, maybe it was in person, someone who just like mentioned in passing. And so when you're doing like focused practice in music, you want to get better at an instrument. When you know that you're doing some particular movement wrong and you're just trying to get through the whole piece, he's like, that's practicing your mistakes. You're teaching your body that that's how you're supposed to hold the guitar, or that this is the thing, and then you're going to have to unlearn those mistakes. So even though you do need to spend some time getting through an entire piece, he's like, that stuck with me. Of put in the effort, fix the thing that you know is wrong, that you're doing with your skills, and don't practice your mistakes.
And you can apply that to pretty much anything, right?
Yeah, like building habits and stuff like that. When read more about habits and things in the last few years, and it's like, yeah, whatever we're repeatedly doing, we're also sort of training ourselves to continue doing. So I found that to be really, really good advice.
Exactly, exactly. Okay, number 7, another this or that, NPM or Yarn or something else.
I don't really care.
That's
So
that is a fair answer. I like that
yeah,
too.
yeah. There's I see this with a lot of tools where there's sort of an ergonomics arms race, and one will pull ahead, will have something. Like I think Yarn is great for monorepos with multiple packages and stuff. It seems to be more popular for that. So for that reason, because I work in a monorepo, I haven't like worked with NPM in a while, but it always
Mm.
seems like the tools in their next major catch up with a lot of the more popular things from the other tool. So just whatever is fine for me.
And that's why it's really nice to have 2 or more, because then they're each one is kind of what's the saying, the rising tide raises all ships or something like that. That's not right.
Right, and you're never blocked. Like, yeah, I think PMPM has an edge for speed and caching packages that you install and
Mhm.
stuff like that. So like, I don't think I have enough pain in my life related to that problem that I want to go and investigate more. But I do like that if I was blocked by something in the architectural choices of NPM, I have 2 other package managers at least to think about before I'm like blocked. It's great.
Exactly, exactly. Okay, number 8, what's the worst mistake that you've made in your career as a developer specifically?
Worst mistake that I've made in my career as a developer. Um, I might have waited too long to move into this field. I think I really enjoy it, and I liked the job I had before as well. But I was probably ready for like employment maybe a couple of years before I started looking for jobs in earnest. Um, I think it takes a while because I come from a different background, right? Like I said, nonprofit work, and my degrees were not in computer science or anything. So it takes a while to develop the self belief to like switch gears. So maybe it. That's your quick answer anyway.
Okay, I'll take it. I'll take it. All right, last one, number 9. If you can host a lunch with anyone, one person who is alive or not, who would it be?
um, all right, the one that comes to mind is the poet Kevin Higgins, who's an Irish poet. He just recently passed away, like a week ago. And he's somebody that I had some interactions with over the years as I was a little bit interested in writing, maybe 10, 15 years ago. And I just remembered seeing the tributes to him, like how great he is and how nice it would be to talk to him again. So everybody should go check out Kevin Higgins.
Kevin Higgins. Okay, I'm gonna do it. All right, thanks, Mark. This was a really really great show. Appreciate you being here with us.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me on.
Absolutely. Now, before we go, you feel free to take a minute, tell listeners, viewers how to get in touch with you, and feel free to plug anything else that you're working on.
Sure. So I'm on Twitter at Mark T. Noonan, and I'm on LinkedIn. That's a fine way to get in touch with me too. We have a Cypress Discord that you can find on our Cypress website, cypress.io. And I'm pretty active in there, especially if you tag me. There's a lot of communication in there, but if you have questions about testing or something, that's a good place to get in touch with me. I suppose I'll plug a stream I'm doing tomorrow that will be hands-on with component testing with Nick Taylor. So that's in my most recent Twitter stuff. I don't know like the address to put in here, but that'll be some chat and also just some hands-on. Like I'll teach Nick how to use component testing. So if you're interested in Cypress component testing, that's something to check out.
Fantastic. All right. Thank you. Okay. And a quick reminder that these shows are now recorded live on the first and third Tuesdays of each month at 1 p.m. Eastern time in the US, which is 5 p.m. GMT. We're then later syndicating them on CFE.dev and YouTube as videos and also in audio format wherever you prefer to get your podcasts. We're coming back in 3 weeks. We have a kind of an extended break here. It's going to be February 7th with Henri Helvetica. And we're likely going to spend most of that time on website performance, and we'll touch on some accessibility, which we mentioned a little bit today. So that'll be kind of a fun continuation. And then a quick reminder that the jam.dev is coming up Wednesday and Thursday next week, January 25th, 26th. It's a 2-day virtual conference from CFE. And I get to co-host with Brian Rinaldi, so I'm super excited about this. It's going to be a great set of sessions it's a great star-studded cast. So it's going to be a ton of fun. You can visit thejam.dev to learn more. Hope to see you there. And from all of us at CFE.dev, thank you for joining us for this show, and I'll see you next time.